Can trust be born between strangers when both carry ghosts too heavy to bury? The depot bell tolled 8 times as Sarah Millman swept the schoolhouse steps for the last time. Each stroke reminded her that Tuesday meant the eastbound stage, and eastbound meant away from the 3 men asking about Garrett's missing deed. She pressed her hand to the small of her back, feeling the baby shift restless as storm clouds. 6 months along, and still the postcard from Denver promised what felt like lies now. Come when ready. Work. Waiting. JG in her dead husband's careful script. The paper had yellowed since March, soft from handling, but the words stayed sharp as accusations. Miss Sarah. The voice came quiet from the schoolhouse door. She turned to find Joseph Crowfeather, the Apache scout who'd been pacing the town's edges for 3 days. His presence unsettled the merchants, but Sarah had watched him help old Mrs. Henderson with her water bucket, seen him leave coins on the blind fiddler's hat. Men who meant harm didn't tend horses with such gentle hands. The riders came back, he said, nodding toward Main Street. Asked at the post office. Asked at the livery. Sarah's fingers found the postcard in her apron pocket. What did they want to know? About papers. About property east of Devil's Canyon. His dark eyes held steady on hers. About a woman traveling alone. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a warning or a plea. She'd been foolish to think 3 months in Millfield would be long enough to disappear. James Garrett's men had long memories and longer reach. The stage leaves at noon, she said. More to herself than to him. That's what they're counting on. Thunder rolled across the mesa, and the first fat drops of rain struck the dust at their feet. Sarah watched Joseph Crowfeather's face, reading the calculations there, distance, weather, time. Men like him survived by seeing trouble before it found them. There's another way east, he said finally. Takes longer. Harder on a woman in your condition. Sarah pulled the postcard from her pocket, held it out for him to see. The address in Denver seemed as distant as heaven, but it was the only anchor she had in the storm coming. My husband's brother. He doesn't know about the baby. Doesn't know James is dead. Joseph studied the card without taking it. What about the deed? Burned with everything else. She folded the postcard carefully, tucked it back in her apron. But those men think I have it. Think I know where James hid their money. Do you? The question hung between them like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Sarah met his gaze, weighing truth against safety, trust against desperation. The baby turned again, and she made her choice the way James had taught her, quick and clean. No room for doubt. No, she said. But that won't stop them from trying to make me remember things I never knew. A crack of lightning split the sky, and the school bell's weather vanes spun wild in the sudden wind. Joseph Crowfeather stepped back from the doorway, his hand moving to the leather pouch at his belt. Get what you need. Leave everything else. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd outrun worse than weather. We leave before the rain stops. Sarah looked back through the schoolhouse door at the neat rows of desks, the alphabet she'd written on the board that morning, the small life she'd tried to build from the ashes of the old one. The baby pressed against her spine, impatient as the storm. She closed the door without looking back. The cabin stood like a prayer answered in the pine grove, smoke rising steady from its chimney. Joseph had found it just as the afternoon sun broke through the storm clouds, his silent tracking leading them to shelter when Sarah's strength finally gave way. Whose place is this? Sarah asked, leaning heavy against the doorframe. Mine, when I need it. Joseph lifted her satchel from his shoulder, set it gentle on the wooden step. Built it for times like this. Inside, the single room held everything necessary and nothing extra. A stone fireplace, a sturdy table, shelves lined with supplies. Sarah sank into the wooden chair by the fire, feeling the baby settle low and restless. Her back ached something fierce, and her feet had swollen past the comfort of her boots. Joseph moved quiet around the space, lighting an oil lamp, setting water to boil. His hands worked with the same careful attention she'd seen him give to wounded animals. No wasted motion, no hurry that might cause harm. How far to Denver from here? She asked. 5 days? Maybe 6. Depends on the baby. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the tight pull that had been coming and going since they'd left Millfield. Not labor, not yet. but a warning that time was running shorter than distance. Joseph knelt beside the fireplace, feeding dry kindling to the flames. The light caught the silver threads in his black hair, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent reading sign in dangerous country. He'd guided her through 8 hours of rough trail without complaint, matching his pace to her limitations, finding game paths she never would have seen. "Why are you helping me?" The question came out softer than she'd intended, but Joseph's hands never paused in their work. "Had a sister once. Same situation as you." He settled back on his heels, watching the fire catch. Different men chasing her. Same kind of trouble. What happened to her? She didn't make it to the cabin. The words hit Sarah like cold water. She understood then why he'd insisted they leave the main trail, why he'd stopped to listen for hoofbeats that never came, why his eyes kept checking the windows even now. Joseph stood, moved to the shelves, came back with a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was cornbread, still soft, and strips of jerky that smelled of sage and smoke. "Eat," he said. "Then rest. We start before dawn." Sarah took the bread but didn't bite into it. Those riders. How many were there? 3 when they came through town. But Garrett's got more men than that. How do you know about Garrett? Joseph's face went still in the firelight. For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached into his shirt, pulled out a small piece of metal that caught the lamplight, a deputy's star, tarnished with age and wear, chased him across 2 territories. Never got close enough. He tucked the star away, but I know his methods, know the kind of men who ride for him. Sarah bit into the cornbread, tasting the sweetness and the grit of cornmeal ground by careful hands. The baby quieted as she ate, as if sensing safety in this small room that smelled of pine smoke and honest work. "The deed they're looking for," Joseph said. "What made it so important?" "Water rights. James found a spring up in Devil's Canyon that could turn 1,000 acres of scrub into good grazing land. Drew up the papers, filed the claim." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering her husband bent over the kitchen table, working by lamplight. But Garrett had been using that water for years. Figured it belonged to him by right of being there first. So he killed your husband for it. It wasn't a question. Sarah opened her eyes, met Joseph's steady gaze. Made it look like an accident. "Runaway horse," they said. But James was the best rider in 3 counties. The fire settled in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. Sarah pulled the yellowed postcard from her pocket, smoothed it against her knee. "This is all I have left of him. The brother in Denver, the promise of work." She held the card toward the firelight, reading the familiar words again. "I don't even know if the address is still good." Joseph leaned forward, studied the postcard without taking it. "John Garrett. Same name as his brother, yes." Sarah folded the card carefully. James always said John was the good one in the family. Left home, young, made an honest living. "You sure about that?" The question hung in the warm air like smoke. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest, a doubt she'd been carrying without naming it. She'd never met John Garrett, knew him only through James's stories and this single postcard. What if blood ran thicker than she'd hoped? "No," she said finally. "But it's the only chance I've got." Joseph nodded, stood to check the water boiling over the fire. He moved like a man who'd spent years trusting his instincts, reading the truth in small signs. Sarah watched his face in the firelight, saw the calculation there. "We'll find out together," he said. The second morning brought clear sky and the sound of distant horses. Joseph woke Sarah before the sun touched the cabin's eastern window, his hand gentle on her shoulder but his eyes already scanning the tree line. "How many?" she whispered, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. 2, maybe 3. Still a mile out, but coming steady. He moved to the window, parted the curtain just enough to see. "We've got maybe 20 minutes. Sarah's back seized as she tried to stand, the baby pressing down hard against her pelvis. A contraction, stronger than the ones that had been teasing her all night. She breathed through it, counted to 10, felt it ease. "Can you ride?" Joseph asked, watching her face. "Have to." He'd already saddled the horses, loaded her few possessions into saddlebags designed for quick travel. Sarah pulled on her boots, grimacing as her swollen feet pressed against the leather. The postcard went into her dress pocket, close to her heart. They led the horses out the back of the cabin into the thick stand of pines that would hide their movement until they reached the ridge. Joseph moved like smoke through the trees, finding paths that seemed to exist only when he needed them. Sarah followed as best she could, one hand on the saddle horn, the other pressed to her aching back. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer. There. Joseph pointed to a game trail that switched back up the steep slope. We climb for half a mile, then drop down into Willow Creek. Follow that east till we hit the old mining road. Sarah looked up at the trail, measuring it against her condition. The baby had been restless all night, and the contractions were coming more regular now. Not close enough to worry, not yet, but close enough to remind her that nature kept its own schedule. What about them? She nodded toward the sound of pursuit. I'll slow them down. Before Sarah could protest, Joseph had pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checked the load with practiced hands. The metal caught the early light. Clean and ready. You keep to the trail. Don't stop till you reach the mining road. He swung up into his saddle, easy as breathing. If something happens to me, head for Broken Ridge. There's a telegraph office there, and the sheriff's honest. Joseph, no, this is what I do. His voice carried the quiet authority she'd come to trust. Get yourself and that baby to safety. That's what matters now. He spurred his horse toward the sound of approaching riders, leaving Sarah alone with the wind in the pines and the weight of choice pressing down like the baby in her womb. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, and she breathed through it while listening to the hoofbeats fade. Then came the crack of rifle fire. Sarah pointed her horse up the game trail and began to climb. The path proved worse than it looked. Steep, rocky, with loose shale that shifted under the horse's hooves. Sarah's mare picked her way careful up the slope, but every step sent jarring pain through Sarah's back and hips. The baby seemed to press heavier with each upward foot, and the contractions were coming every 10 minutes now, regular as clockwork. At the ridge, she stopped to rest and listen. No more gunfire, but she could hear voices carrying on the morning air, angry voices, men frustrated by lost time and false trails. Joseph had kept his word about slowing them down, but for how long? The descent into Willow Creek Valley offered easier going, but Sarah's strength was fading fast. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her shoulders, and her water was running low. The baby shifted restless, and another contraction caught her halfway down the slope. This one was different, deeper, more insistent, with a pull in her lower back that spoke of serious business. Sarah gripped the saddle horn and rode it out, counting breaths until it passed. When she could think straight again, she realized the truth she'd been avoiding since dawn. The baby was coming. Not in days or weeks, but in hours. The mining road appeared just as Joseph had promised, a rutted track that wound east through stands of aspen and pine. Sarah turned her mare toward Denver and tried to calculate distances against time. 5 days to the city, but the baby wouldn't wait 5 days. Maybe not even one. That's when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. Sarah looked back to see a single rider picking his way down from the ridge, moving fast but careful on the steep trail. Not Joseph, this horse and rider were unfamiliar, and something in the way the man sat his saddle spoke of purpose that had nothing to do with help. She urged her mare into a trot, the best speed she could manage in her condition. The mining road stretched ahead like a promise, but promises had been breaking all around her lately. Behind her, the pursuing rider reached the valley floor and spurred his horse to a gallop. Another contraction hit, just as Sarah spotted the abandoned mine works ahead, a cluster of weathered buildings and the dark mouth of a shaft cut into the hillside. She pulled up beside the largest structure, a mill house with walls thick enough to stop bullets, and slid from the saddle just as the pain reached its peak. The rider was maybe 2 minutes behind her now. Sarah pulled her rifle from its scabbard, checked the action with hands that shook only a little. James had taught her to shoot, and recent events had taught her when shooting was necessary. She found cover behind the mill house's stone foundation and settled in to wait. The rider came into view around a bend in the road, a lean man in a black hat, riding a paint horse with white stockings. He pulled up when he saw Sarah's mare standing riderless, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Sarah Millman, he called. Like to talk to you about some papers. Don't have any papers, Sarah called back, keeping the rifle steady on his chest. That's not what James told us before he died. The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah felt the baby shift, felt another contraction building, and forced herself to breathe steady. This man had been there when James died, had maybe been the one to make it happen. James died in a riding accident, she said. The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. James died because he wouldn't say where he hid Garrett's deed. Died hard, too, once we got him away from town. Rage rose in Sarah's throat like bile. Her finger found the rifle's trigger, and for a moment, the distance between intention and action narrowed to almost nothing. The man seemed to sense her thought, because his hand moved quick to his gun. That's when Joseph Crowfeather rose from the tall grass beside the road, his own rifle centered on the rider's back. Let it go slow, Joseph said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd made such requests before. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt like hours. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the man in the black hat, while Joseph held his position in the tall grass, and somewhere in the space between them lay the weight of all the choices that had brought them to this moment. Then the man's shoulders sagged, and he let his gun drop to the ground. Smart, Joseph said, stepping into the road. Now, climb down. Real gentle. The man dismounted, his movements careful and controlled. Up close, Sarah could see the dust on his clothes, the sweat stains that spoke of hard riding. He'd been chasing them since before dawn, maybe longer. You're making a mistake, the man said, looking between Sarah and Joseph. Garrett's got a dozen men riding these hills. You think you can outrun them all? Done it so far, Joseph replied. He picked up the dropped pistol, tucked it into his belt. What's your name? Pike. And you're the Apache scout from Millfield. Garrett posted a reward for you too. Sarah felt another contraction building and tried to breathe through it without showing weakness. The baby was coming faster now, maybe 2 hours if she was lucky. 2 hours to find shelter, safety, someone who knew how to help when the time came. There's a town up ahead, she managed. Broken Ridge. How far? Joseph's eyes flicked to her face, reading the signs there. Hour's ride. Maybe less. I won't make it that far. The words came out flat and certain, the truth she'd been avoiding since the contractions started coming regular. Joseph looked at Pike, then back at Sarah, calculating risks and options with the quick mind that had kept them alive this far. There's an old line shack about half a mile up the creek, he said, finally. Used to be a way station for the mining crews. Should have what we need. What about him? Sarah nodded toward Pike. Joseph studied the man for a long moment. Pike was lean and hard-looking, with the kind of scars that came from violent work, but his eyes held something like respect when he looked at Sarah, maybe even sympathy. Garrett pay you well? Joseph asked. Well enough. Better than a deputy's wages? Pike's face went still. You're a lawman. Joseph pulled the tarnished star from his shirt, let it catch the afternoon light. Territory deputy. Been tracking Garrett for 2 years now. Then you know what he's capable of. I know what you're capable of, too. Question is whether you're willing to do it to a pregnant woman. Pike looked at Sarah, really looked at her, maybe seeing past the fugitive to the person underneath. His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, and something shifted in his expression. Got a wife back in Kansas, he said quietly. Lost our first baby. Complications. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt the contraction peak and begin to fade, leaving her breathless but alert. Pike's face had gone soft around the edges, and she recognized the look guilt wearing the mask of memory. Help us get to the line shack, Joseph said. After that, you can ride back to Garrett and tell him whatever you need to tell him, and if I don't, then I arrest you for conspiracy in the murder of James Millman. Take you back to Millfield in chains. Pike considered this, his eyes moving from the badge to Sarah's rifle to the surrounding hills where more of Garrett's men might be riding. When he looked at Sarah again, she saw the decision forming. I'll help, he said. But Garrett won't be fooled for long. He'll figure out where you went. Let us worry about Garrett. Joseph retrieved Pike's horse, helped Sarah back into her saddle with hands that lingered just long enough to offer comfort. The baby had gone quiet, gathering strength for what was coming, and Sarah could feel her own body preparing for the work ahead. The line shack sat in a grove of cottonwoods beside a clear-running creek, its log walls weathered silver by seasons of mountain weather. Inside, they found what Joseph had promised: bunks with clean straw ticking, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with supplies left by miners and maintained by travelers who understood the code of the high country. Pike surprised them both by knowing something about midwifery. Helped with the animals back home, he explained, building up the fire while Joseph heated water. Figured it couldn't be much different. Sarah wanted to laugh at the comparison, but another contraction stole her breath. They were coming every 5 minutes now, hard enough to double her over, and she could feel the baby dropping lower with each one. "Joseph," she gasped as the pain eased. The postcard. He found it in her dress pocket, smoothed the yellowed paper with careful fingers. "You want me to wire ahead? Let John Garrett know you're coming?" "Yes. But don't mention James. Don't mention the baby." She gripped his hand as another contraction built. "Just say I'm traveling. Need work." Joseph nodded, understanding the caution. If John Garrett turned out to be cut from the same cloth as his brother, advance warning could be dangerous. Better to arrive unexpected than to walk into a prepared trap. The contraction peaked, stronger than any before, and Sarah cried out despite herself. Pike moved to the window, checking the trail they'd followed, while Joseph knelt beside the bunk with the calm presence she'd come to depend on. "Won't be long now," he said quietly. Outside, the sun was sliding toward the western peaks, painting the cottonwoods gold and green. Sarah watched the light move across the cabin's single window and tried to imagine what her child would see when it opened its eyes. For the first time, this wild country, these dangerous men, this uncertain future stretching ahead like the long road to Denver. Another contraction hit, and she stopped thinking about anything except the work at hand. The baby chose sunset to make her appearance in the world, arriving in a rush of pain and relief that left Sarah gasping on the crude bunk, while Joseph wrapped the tiny girl in his cleanest shirt. Outside, the cottonwoods whispered in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance came the sound of approaching horses. "How many?" Sarah whispered, holding her daughter close. Pike peered through the window, counting shadows moving through the trees. 4, maybe 5. They found our trail. The baby was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair that reminded Sarah of James. She'd weighed maybe 5 pounds, small but strong, with lungs that announced her displeasure at being born into a world full of trouble. "She needs a name," Joseph said, checking his rifle with movements that had become automatic. Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, seeing James there in the shape of her nose, the stubborn set of her tiny jaw. "Grace," she said. "Grace Millman. Pretty name for a pretty girl." Pike had moved to the other window, his borrowed rifle covering the approach from the east. "But we got company coming, and they don't sound like they're here to offer congratulations." The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by voices Garrett's men, calling back and forth as they spread out to surround the cabin. Sarah counted at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more, and felt her heart sink. Even with Pike's help, 3 adults and a newborn baby couldn't fight their way past that many armed men. "There's another way," Joseph said quietly. He knelt beside the bunk, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. "Creek runs behind the cabin, cuts through a canyon that comes out near Broken Ridge. Water's shallow this time of year. What about Grace? She's small, hardy. Mountain babies always are." Sarah looked down at her daughter, sleeping now after the exertion of being born. Grace seemed impossibly fragile, her skin translucent in the lamplight, her breathing so quiet it barely stirred the cloth wrapped around her. The thought of carrying her into cold creek water, of running through the night with pursuers behind them, made Sarah's chest tight with fear. "They're here," Pike said. The hoofbeats had stopped just outside rifle range, and now came the sound of men dismounting, moving through the trees with the careful patience of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. A voice called out across the clearing Garrett himself, Sarah realized with a chill. "Sarah Millman. Know you're in there. Come out with the papers, and we'll let you walk away." Sarah exchanged glances with Joseph and Pike. They all knew Garrett's promises weren't worth the air he used to make them. He'd killed James for less than what they'd cost him today. "Don't have any papers," Sarah called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Your husband said different before he died. Told us about a deed hidden somewhere safe. About water rights that rightfully belong to me. James burned those papers before he died. Burned them rather than let you have them." The lie came easy, because it felt true in the way that mattered. James would have destroyed the deed rather than let it fall into Garrett's hands, would have chosen principle over profit every time. It was why she'd loved him, and why Garrett had killed him. "Maybe so," Garrett called. "But you're still worth something to me, Sarah. You and that baby you just had." The words hit like ice water. Garrett knew about Grace, which meant he'd been watching longer than they'd realized. Sarah felt Joseph's hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "Creek's about 30 yards behind us," he whispered. "Deep brush most of the way. We can make it if we move quiet." Pike checked his rifle one more time. "What about me?" "Your choice," Joseph said. "But choose quick." Outside, they could hear Garrett's men moving into position, surrounding the cabin with the methodical precision of experienced killers. Sarah wrapped Grace tighter in the makeshift blanket, pressing the tiny girl against her chest, where her heartbeat might provide comfort. "I'm coming with you," Pike said. "Wife would never forgive me if I let something happen to that baby." Joseph nodded, moved to the back wall where a narrow window opened onto the creek. The frame was warped from years of mountain weather, and it took both men to work it open without making noise. Cool air flowed in, carrying the scent of running water and wild sage. "Sarah goes first," Joseph whispered. "Pike, you follow. I'll come last. Cover our trail." Sarah stood carefully, testing her strength. The birth had taken everything she had, but adrenaline was lending her borrowed energy. Grace stirred against her chest, making soft sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. "Shh, baby girl," Sarah whispered. "We're going for a walk." She climbed through the window with Joseph's help, her legs shaking as they took her weight. The creek was exactly where he'd said it would be, running shallow and clear over smooth stones. Pike followed, moving with surprising quiet for such a big man. That's when the shooting started. Garrett's men had grown impatient with negotiation, and rifle fire erupted from 3 sides of the cabin. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and Sarah heard men shouting orders in the chaos. She waded into the creek, gasping at the cold water that soaked through her boots and skirts. Joseph appeared beside them, moving backward with his rifle trained on the cabin. "They'll figure out we're gone soon enough. We need distance." The creek bed offered treacherous footing in the darkness, but it also provided cover from the worst of the pursuit. Sarah stumbled along behind Pike, one hand holding Grace close, the other gripping rocks and branches to keep her balance. The baby had gone quiet, as if sensing the danger around them. Behind them, the gunfire slackened, then stopped entirely. Voices rose in the sudden silence. Angry voices, frustrated voices, the sound of men who discovered their quarry had slipped the trap. "There," Pike whispered, pointing ahead. Canyon mouth, the creek cut between high stone walls that would hide them from casual pursuit. Sarah looked back once at the line shack, saw flames beginning to lick at its roof. Garrett was erasing evidence, making sure no trace remained of what had happened here. They entered the canyon just as the first pursuing rider reached the creek. The passage through stone proved narrow and winding, following the water as it carved its patient path toward the distant lights of Broken Ridge. Sarah's strength was failing fast, and Grace had begun to fuss, hungry and cold in her inadequate wrappings. "How much further?" Sarah gasped. "Mile, maybe 2, Joseph replied, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Behind them, hoofbeats splashed in the creek, growing closer despite the difficult terrain. Garrett's men were persistent, and they knew these hills as well as anyone. The canyon would slow pursuit, but it wouldn't stop it. That's when they heard the whistle, long, low, mournful in the mountain air. "Train," Pike said, and there was something like hope in his voice. Joseph nodded. "Denver and Rio Grande. Comes through Broken Ridge every evening, eastbound. Can we make it?" Sarah looked down at Grace, who was crying now in earnest, her tiny voice echoing off the stone walls. The sound would carry, might bring pursuit faster than they could move. But the train whistle meant escape, meant safety, meant a chance to reach Denver and the uncertain sanctuary of John Garrett's address. We make it, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. They stumbled out of the canyon just as the locomotive's headlights swept across the depot platform. Broken Ridge was little more than a wide spot in the railroad. A few buildings, a water tower, a station house where the telegrapher was already closing his office for the night. The train was slowing but not stopping, taking on water for the long climb over the Continental Divide. Sarah ran toward the platform on legs that barely held her, Pike and Joseph flanking her like guardian angels, their rifles ready for the pursuit that was surely coming. There, Joseph pointed to a passenger car near the rear of the train. Doors open. They reached the platform just as riders poured out of the canyon mouth behind them, 6 men with Garrett in the lead, their horses lathered and their faces grim in the locomotive's glare. Sarah saw Garrett's eyes find her across the distance, saw his hand move to the gun at his hip. Joseph boosted her up onto the train steps just as the locomotive whistle screamed again. Pike swung up behind her, then turned to help Joseph aboard. But the Apache scout was backing away, his rifle trained on the approaching riders. "Joseph," Sarah called. "Get to Denver," he shouted back. "Find John Garrett. Tell him what his brother did." The train lurched forward, wheels grinding on steel rails. Sarah leaned out the door, reaching for Joseph's hand, but he was already moving away, fading into the shadows beside the water tower. Garrett's men reached the platform just as the passenger car cleared the station. Sarah saw muzzle flashes, heard bullets strike the train's wooden sides, but the locomotive was gathering speed now, pulling them away from danger and into the uncertain promise of the eastern night. Grace cried against her chest, tiny and perfect and alive. Sarah held her daughter close and watched Broken Ridge disappear behind them, carrying with it the last trace of Joseph Crowfeather and the mountain valley where her old life had ended. The train climbed through the darkness toward Denver, toward morning, toward whatever waited at the address written on a yellowed postcard that had already carried them further than hope had any right to go. The Union Station clock showed 6:30 when Sarah Millman stepped down from the eastbound train, carrying her 3-day-old daughter into the gray Denver dawn. The city smell hit her first: coal, smoke, and horse manure, coffee and bacon from the depot restaurant, the underlying scent of too many people living too close together. Grace had slept through most of the journey, waking only to nurse when the train stopped for water. She seemed content in her wrappings, unbothered by the change from mountain silence to urban noise. A city baby now, Sarah thought, born to motion and uncertainty. The postcard felt warm in her pocket as she made her way through the crowded station. 3 days had been long enough to memorize every word of James's careful script, but the paper itself had become something more than message, a talisman, a bridge between the woman she'd been and whoever she was becoming. She found the address on a tree-lined street, 6 blocks from the station, a modest house with a well-tended garden and lace curtains in the windows. The man who answered her knock looked so much like James that Sarah's breath caught in her throat. John Garrett? Yes. His eyes took in her travel-stained dress, the bundle in her arms, the exhaustion written plain on her face. "Can I help you?" Sarah pulled out the postcard, held it toward him with fingers that trembled only slightly. "I'm Sarah Millman, James's wife." John's face went through several changes before settling on something like grief. James's wife. But he said. He wrote that he was married, yes, to me. Sarah straightened her shoulders, found strength she didn't know she still possessed. "He's dead, John. Killed by your brother's men 3 months ago." The words hung in the morning air between them. John's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and Sarah saw the family resemblance not just in his features, but in the way he carried anger, controlled, purposeful, dangerous when released. "Come inside," he said finally. The house was everything James had promised. It would be clean, comfortable, filled with the kind of quiet prosperity that came from honest work and careful saving. John led her to a parlor furnished with simple wooden chairs and a horsehair sofa, gesturing for her to sit while he poured coffee from a pot that smelled of chicory and home. "Tell me about my brother," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Tell me how he died." Sarah told him everything: the water rights, the hidden deed, the men who'd come asking questions with guns in their hands. She spoke of James's last morning, the way he'd kissed her goodbye like always, never knowing it was the final time. John listened without interruption, his jaw growing tighter with each detail. When she finished, Grace stirred in her arms and began to fuss. John's expression softened as he looked at the baby, seeing perhaps an echo of the brother he'd lost. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "What's her name?" "Grace. Grace Millman." James would have been proud. He never knew about her. I wasn't showing when he died. John stood, moved to the window that looked out on the quiet street. Denver was waking up around them, the clip-clop of delivery wagons, the distant sound of the trolley bell, children calling to each other on their way to school. "I haven't seen my brother in 15 years, John said. "Left home when he married into the Garrett name, thought I could make something better of myself out here. Built a freight business, bought this house, saved enough to bring him west when he was ready. He talked about you often. Said you were the good one in the family." John's laugh held no humor. The good one. While he was trying to make an honest life and getting killed for it. He turned from the window, and Sarah saw something hard settle in his features. "What about the men who killed him? What about my other brother, your other? Jake Garrett. We called him James when we were young, but he took the Garrett name when he married into money. Became someone else entirely." John's voice carried 15 years of distance and disappointment. "I hoped the stories I heard weren't true. Hoped he'd stayed the brother I remembered." Sarah felt the world shift around her, understanding flooding in like cold water. Jake Garrett, not James Garrett. The brother who'd taken another family's name and made it feared across 2 territories. The brother John had been trying to forget. "He's still alive," she said. "Still in Colorado, still hunting people like me." "Not anymore." The words came out flat and final, carrying the weight of decision made and sealed. John moved to a writing desk in the corner, pulled out paper and pen, began writing with the careful precision of a man who understood the power of written words. "What are you doing?" "Writing to the territorial marshal, and to the railroad, and to every honest lawman between here and the Colorado border." John's pen moved steady across the paper. "My brother killed James Millman for water rights that never belonged to him. Time someone made him answer for it." Grace began to cry, and Sarah shifted her to nurse, grateful for the privacy of the lace curtains. Through the window, she could see Denver spreading out toward the mountains, a city built on the dreams of people who'd come west, looking for something better. "The postcard," she said. "The one that brought me here." James signed it. J. G. I thought. James Garrett was the name he was born with. Jake kept it for business, but James stayed himself. John finished writing, set the pen aside with careful precision. "He sent that card because he trusted me to take care of what mattered to him. That's you, Sarah. You and the baby. I don't have anywhere else to go. Then you'll stay here, long as you need to." The offer hung in the morning light, like a promise kept across years and distance. Sarah looked down at Grace, who'd fallen asleep at her breast, tiny and perfect and safe for the first time since leaving Millfield. The baby's breathing was steady and strong, unburdened by the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future. "There's something else," John said. He moved to a safe built into the wall behind his desk, worked the combination with practiced fingers. From inside, he pulled a thick envelope sealed with wax. "James sent this 6 months ago, said to keep it safe, give it to his wife if anything happened to him." Sarah's hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside were legal papers, a deed to the water rights in Devil's Canyon, properly filed and witnessed, along with a letter in James's careful script. "Sarah," she read silently, "if you're reading this, then my fears have come true and Jake's men have found me. The water rights are yours now, worth enough to buy a good life somewhere safe. But more than that, they're proof of what happened, evidence that honest law can use against dishonest men. Give them to John. He'll know what to do. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to see our child born. Make sure he knows his father tried to leave him something better than the life we had. Forever yours, James." Sarah folded the letter carefully, handed the deed to John. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew what was coming." John examined the papers with the eye of a man who understood legal documents. Water rights to the spring in Devil's Canyon, filed and recorded proper, with James Millman listed as the claimant. He looked up at Sarah with something like amazement. "Do you know what this means? That James died for nothing?" That Jake killed him for papers he could have had legally? Number John's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd found justice in an unjust world. It means Jake's been using water that belongs to you, been running cattle on land he has no right to touch. And it means every head of stock he's sold, every dollar he's made, every threat he's issued, all of it based on stolen property. Grace stirred in Sarah's arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking. Her eyes opened, dark and serious, seeming to focus on Sarah's face with an intensity that was almost adult. "Hello, baby girl," Sarah whispered. "Welcome to your new life." Outside, the Denver morning was growing brighter, and somewhere in the distance came the sound of a train whistle. Another arrival, another departure, another story beginning or ending in the sprawling complexity of the West. Sarah held her daughter close and felt something she hadn't experienced since James died. The possibility of peace. "One more thing," John said. He pulled a telegram from his vest pocket, handed it to Sarah. "Came this morning, addressed to you." Sarah unfolded the yellow paper, read the brief message with growing wonder. "Sarah Millman, Denver, stop. Jake Garrett arrested, Millfield, stop. Territorial Marshal wants testimony. Stop, you and baby safe now, stop. Joseph Crowfeather." "He made it," she breathed. "Joseph made it back." "Joseph? The man who saved us." "Apache scout, territorial deputy. He stayed behind so we could escape." John nodded, understanding the debt that could never fully be repaid. Good men are rare in this country, worth remembering their names. Sarah folded the telegram carefully, tucked it into her dress pocket beside the original postcard. 2 pieces of paper, 2 promises kept, 2 bridges between the life she'd lost and the one she was building. Grace yawned, a tiny sound that seemed to fill the quiet parlor with contentment. Soon she would need feeding again and changing and all the small attentions that newborn babies required. But for now, she was simply present, alive, healthy, surrounded by safety and the promise of tomorrow. "What happens next?" Sarah asked. "Next, you rest. You eat. You let that baby grow strong." John stood, moved to the window again, looking out at the street where ordinary people were living ordinary lives. "And when you're ready, we'll figure out what to do with a water spring that's worth more than money." Sarah smiled, feeling the expression strange on her face after so many days of fear and flight. "James always said the best water was the kind you shared. Then we'll share it. Build something good from something that's caused too much pain." Outside, Denver continued its daily business of becoming a city. Inside, a baby born in violence and carried to safety began the long work of becoming herself. And in the space between, Sarah Millman found what she'd been searching for since the morning her old life ended not just survival, but the chance to build something better from the pieces that remained. Grace slept against her chest, breathing steady and sure, unburdened by the weight of yesterday or the uncertainty of tomorrow. She was mountain-born and train-carried, daughter of a murdered father and a mother who'd learned to shoot straight when shooting was necessary. The West would shape her, but it would not break her. The postcard that had carried them so far now rested in Sarah's pocket, its promise fulfilled, but its journey not quite finished. Someday, when Grace was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her about the yellowed paper that had led them home, about the Apache scout who'd shown them the way, about the father who'd loved them enough to die protecting what mattered most. But that was a story for another day. Today was for rest, for healing, for the simple miracle of being alive and safe and together in a house that smelled of coffee and kindness, in a city that sprawled toward mountains where the snow stayed white and clean no matter what happened in the valleys below. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.